There are warnings that exist not to protect property, but to protect people from what waits beyond them. And the faded keep-out signs nailed to the crooked fence at the edge of the woods had been ignored. Many times that they no longer seemed like warnings, but relics of a fear the residents never fully discussed. On a night when the moon hung thin and the wind drifted low through the trees, a beam of light cut unevenly across the forest floor, trembling as the person holding it moved closer to the boundary. The wire fence rattled softly, not from wind, but from something shifting behind it. A slow, deliberate movement that made the air feel colder. The grass near the fence lay pressed in strange patterns, as if something heavy had walked through without leaving visible footprints. The flashlight beam caught the warning sign for a brief second, revealing scratches across its surface that looked too long and too deep to come from weather or age. The person paused, their breath tightening as they tried to make sense of the noise pulling deeper into the woods. A faint rustling drifted toward them, not like leaves moving, but like something dragging itself patiently through the undergrowth. A low groan followed, carrying a tone that did not sound mechanical, animal, or distinctly human, but something caught between all three. The forest had a way of absorbing sound, turning each noise into an echo that lingered even after it faded. And the silence that followed felt far too intentional. The person lifted the flashlight higher, the beams struggling to pierce the dense wall of trees. Their hand trembled slightly when the light reflected off something pale deeper in the woods. But the shape vanished before they could focus. They told themselves it was a deer, or a patch of bark stripped clean. But the uncomfortable truth settled quickly into their chest. Deer did not stand upright, and bark did not move. The fence creaked again under a subtle pressure, as if something pressed against it from the other side. The sound traveled along the wire like a whisper sliding across metal. Something stepped closer, its weight measured, curious, and unhurried. The person took a step back, but the shadows between the trees shifted in response, almost as if the forest itself exhaled with quiet anticipation. They wanted to leave, to turn around, and walk back toward the safety of the dirt road. But a strange heaviness settled near their feet, rooting them to the ground. The woods seemed to lean inward, the trees narrowing around the space where the person stood, forming a corridor of darkness that felt too deliberate to be natural. A soft clicking sound broke the silence. It came from just beyond the fence, slow and rhythmic, like nails tapping lightly against wood. The person steadied the flashlight, the beam shaking as they pointed it toward the noise. For a brief moment, the light illuminated a part of the forest floor that should have been empty. Yet the leaves there lay flattened in a perfect circle, as if something had been sitting or standing there moments before. A faint trail of disturbed soil led deeper into the trees, straight and narrow, lacking the chaos of animal movement. The clicking stopped. Then came a shifting sound, as if something tall straightened itself after crouching low. The person felt the air move, not like a breeze, but like the subtle displacement of something rising. The trees in the distance swayed in a slow ripple, one after another, as though something massive passed between them with silent steps. The person whispered a single word, "Hello." "Ah!" But the sound died before reaching the fence, swallowed by the forest as if the woods refused to let that word enter. Then came the breath. A long, low exhale drifted from the darkness, cold enough to tighten the skin on the person's arms. The flashlight flickered. For a moment, the beam revealed a distorted shadow stretching across the leaves. But the shape shifted unnaturally, elongating and twisting in a way that did not match any familiar form. The person stumbled back, the flashlight dropping to the ground, its beam rolling sideways and cutting across the fence line. In that brief sweep of light, the person saw the keep out sign tilt slightly, as if something had brushed against the post moments ago. The shadows behind it swelled, thickened, and then retreated with a speed that made no sense. The woods grew silent once more, not the silence of calm, but silence held tightly by something waiting. The person turned and ran. Stumbling across the uneven ground, the flashlight beam lost behind them. But the sound that followed was not footsteps. It was the fence wire trembling, vibrating in a low hum that traveled through the night air like a warning carried too late. Something shifted behind the trees, pacing the person from within the woods. Moving parallel, silent except for the occasional crack of a branch or the whisper of sliding earth. The person dared not look back. They did not see the tall shadow pause at the edge of the fence, its shape blending with the trunks of the trees, its form bending slightly, as if watching with patient curiosity. But the woods saw everything, and the woods remembered. Later, residents would gather near the old fence, staring at the fresh marks across the posts, the strange circular impressions in the soil, and the heavy stillness hanging over the trees. They would ask the same question that echoed through the darkest corners of their thoughts. If the keep-out signs were never meant for people, then what were they trying to keep inside? Asterisk, the woods that bordered the old fence had been part of the town for so long that no one could recall a time when they were not there. Stretching across the outskirts like a dark sea of trunks and tangled brush, generations had grown up with its heavy presence. Children once played near its edge without thinking. But even they sensed early that the air changed the moment someone stepped too far past the tree line. The wind inside the woods carried a strange weight, colder than the air outside, and it moved with an intention that made the skin prickle. For decades, parents told their children to stay away, as a warning grounded in danger. But as a rule spoken with the same quiet certainty as telling them to avoid deep water or wild dogs. Most children obeyed, though some had wandered close enough to feel a strange pressure settle on their shoulders, as if the woods leaned in behind them. They ran home breathless, without knowing why. The keep-out signs had been nailed to the fence long before anyone alive remembered who placed them there. Some said a man once lived deep within the woods and disappeared under strange circumstances. Others believed the land had a history of people vanishing without explanation. But most residents simply accepted the signs as a part of life. The way they accepted the old crossing signals or rusted hydrant symbols that had always been there, preserved by time and silence. The older residents grew uneasy whenever newcomers questioned the faded warnings. They spoke carefully when discussing the woods, choosing their words as if something might be listening. There were stories they did not share with outsiders. Stories that belonged only to those who had spent their lives hearing strange noises drift from the trees after midnight. Some recalled nights when the woods hummed with a low vibration that traveled across the ground and crept up their legs. Others remembered the sound of snapping branches with no wind, or whispers that seemed to echo from tree to tree. None of them claimed the woods held ghosts or monsters because doing so would have turned their fear into something childish. Instead, they described the woods with a strange respect, calling it restless land or deep ground, as if the place itself had a mind that shifted with the seasons. These phrases confused outsiders, but carried meaning to those who grew up watching the shadows between the trees move just a little too smoothly, as if guided by something invisible. The family who lived closest to the keep-out signs had their own history with the land. They had purchased the property decades earlier, drawn by the silence and the tall shade of the trees, believing it would offer peace and privacy. At first it did, but over the years, strange details began to accumulate. Their dog refused to cross the fence line, even when coaxed. Their motion lights flickered throughout the night, even though nothing triggered them. The ground near the woods softened unpredictably, sinking in patches even during dry seasons. The father of the family once told a neighbor that he felt watched whenever he cleared brush near the fence, as if eyes tracked his every movement from deep within the trees. He laughed while saying it, but his eyes held a tension that suggested the comment was not entirely a joke. The mother admitted she heard footsteps outside their window some nights. Slow and uneven, but every time she checked, nothing moved except the trees swaying with a rhythm that did not match the wind. Their son, long before becoming old enough to understand fear, told them he sometimes saw shapes between the trees during the day, shapes that looked like tall figures bending in unnatural ways. They dismissed his words gently, telling themselves that children misunderstood shadows. But deep down, both parents felt the unspoken possibility that children often saw what adults learned to ignore. Decades passed, and the woods gained a reputation without ever needing an incident to justify it. People treated the fence line like a boundary between the known and something better left untouched. Hunters avoided the area, claiming the wildlife never entered that side of the forest. Hikers passed through quickly, their footsteps sharpening in pace the moment they felt the air turn heavy. Even the birds flew around the treetops rather than over them. The town became accustomed to this strange relationship, accepting it quietly the same way people accept a recurring nightmare, unpleasant, undeniable, and too confusing to confront directly. Conversations about the woods were short and careful. People spoke about them as if speaking too boldly would disturb something. But everything changed when a small group of thrill-seekers decided the keep-out signs were nothing more than rusted metal and local superstition. They wanted a story to brag about, a video to post online, a memory forged from the thrill of doing something forbidden. They approached the fence with confidence, joking about what might wait inside. Their laughter carried into the trees, light and careless. But the woods swallowed the sound quickly, leaving the air unnervingly still. They stepped over the boundary without hesitation, unaware that generations before them had learned the hard way that the signs were not meant to protect the woods from people. They were meant to protect people from what moved silently through the dark, listening to every step and waiting for those who believed the boundary existed only in metal, not in meaning, the moment the group crossed the fence. The woods reacted in a way none of them understood. Although the signs were subtle enough that they brushed them aside, the air shifted with a slow heaviness, as if the forest exhaled after holding its breath for too long. The first few steps felt harmless, but beneath their shoes the ground softened strangely, almost pulsing with each movement. The trees grew denser with unnatural consistency, their branches curving inward as though guiding the group deeper along a path that had not existed moments before. The thrill they expected did not arrive. Instead, an uneasy silence wrapped around them. Even their own voices sounded muted, swallowed by a thickness that pressed against their ears. They joked at first, tossing out comments about how the place felt staged or artificial. But every laugh died quickly, absorbed by an atmosphere that refused to let sound travel freely. The deeper they walked, the more the forest began to behave in ways that defied familiarity. Leaves rustled without wind. Branches shivered without movement. Shadows stretched with strange precision, almost reaching toward them like slow, patient hands. One of them remarked quietly that the trees looked older the farther they went, their bark darker, their knots deeper. Their shapes bent at angles that suggested they had grown in the presence of something that influenced their direction. No one responded because each person felt a rising tension they did not want to name. Then the sounds began. At first it was a faint tapping, rhythmic and distant, drifting through the trees like the echo of wood striking wood. They paused, listening, but the forest fell silent again, as if mocking their curiosity. When they moved forward, the tapping resumed, this time slightly closer. One of the group said it must be a woodpecker, but another pointed out that the taps were too slow and too evenly spaced, almost like deliberate signals. Moments later, a low groan carried through the trees, long and strained, like the earth shifting beneath them. The group froze. They looked at one another wide-eyed, as the groan faded into a soft, dragging sound that circled them several times before stopping abruptly. The forest grew still again, but the stillness felt wrong, charged, as if every tree held its breath along with them. They whispered now, their earlier confidence dissolving as the woods thickened around them. They noticed that the ground showed no signs of wildlife. No tracks, no nests. Not even insects. The forest floor looked untouched, as if nothing had lived or moved there for a long time. One of them commented that the woods felt empty in a way that made emptiness itself feel alive. They decided to turn back. But when they retraced their steps, nothing looked the same. The path behind them narrowed, curving in a direction none of them recognized. The markings they remembered, a crooked stump, a fallen branch, a patch of moss, were missing. The woods had rearranged themselves. Panic began to stir quietly at first. They tried using their phones for direction. The screens flickered between apps, their compasses spinning wildly, unable to distinguish north from south. The air grew colder with each passing minute, not gradually, but in sudden drops, as if they stepped through pockets of unnatural temperature. Their breath fogged, even though the night was not cold enough for it. A soft clicking sound returned, this time directly behind them. When they turned, nothing stood there. only trees bent into strange shapes that looked almost like silhouettes frozen mid-motion. The clicking moved again, weaving between trunks, circling them with slow, deliberate curiosity. One of the group called out, asking if anyone was there. But the question slipped into the darkness without echo, swallowed immediately, leaving no trace. They moved faster, their steps uneven and urgent, but the woods responded to their fear. Branches above them creaked in a synchronized pattern, as if something heavy shifted across them without disturbing the leaves. Twice, they heard footsteps that did not match their own, soft and measured, pacing them through the brush. A faint glow appeared deeper inside the woods, pale and flickering, moving with a strange gliding motion. They moved toward it instinctively, believing it might be another person. But the glow vanished each time they approached, reappearing only when they turned away. One of them whispered that it felt like the light was leading them somewhere. And the idea sent a chill through the group because none of them knew if being led was better or worse than being followed. Their voices grew frantic now, low and strained, fear sharpening their movements. The sense of being watched deepened until it felt like a physical presence pressing against their backs. The dragging sound returned, louder this time, as if whatever produced it had grown less concerned about remaining hidden. Something shifted in the shadows to their left, tall enough to brush the lower branches. Then the sound of something breathing rose from the darkness, slow and steady, carrying a cold sweetness that did not resemble any natural scent. They felt the ground tremble lightly beneath them, as if something enormous moved below the roots. One of them said they should run, but even as the word left their mouth, sharp crack echoed from behind them, like wood splitting under immense weight. They turned, hearts pounding, but saw only darkness staring back, thick and patient. The woods did not chase them. The woods waited, because something inside had already noticed them, and whatever lived between those trees never hurried. It simply circled, watched, and listened, learning the rhythm of their fear as if preparing for a moment that had not yet arrived, when authorities finally became involved. Their arrival brought little comfort to the families of the missing group, because even as the investigators approached the fence line, the woods seemed to respond with the same suffocating silence that had swallowed the trespassers. The officers began their work with confident precision, marking the perimeter, documenting the faded keep-out signs, and examining the bent wires along the fence. Yet confidence began to crumble the moment they stepped into the first few feet of shadow. The temperature dropped sharply, enough that several investigators commented on the sudden cold despite wearing layers. Their equipment behaved strangely from the start. Radios flickered into bursts of static, cutting out every few yards. Flashlights dimmed without warning. Cameras failed to capture clear images, producing photos filled with streaks of distorted light or frames blanketed in thick grain as if the woods refused to be recorded. The ground perplexed them further. Soil samples taken near the fence showed patterns of movement beneath the surface. Narrow channels carved with unnatural precision, like something large had traveled beneath the roots without disturbing the surface above. Specialists examined the soil and stated quietly that these patterns did not match those of burrowing animals or water erosion. Instead, they looked almost deliberate, as if shaped by a steady hand. That idea unsettled them more than they cared to admit, as investigators moved deeper. They discovered areas where the leaves had been pressed into smooth depressions, circular in shape and strangely symmetrical, as if something heavy had crouched or lingered in those spots. Yet there were no footprints, no scattered debris, no evidence of dragging or crawling. Even more disturbing were the markings on several nearby trees. The bark had been scraped in long vertical lines, clean and parallel, with no splintering or rough edges. These marks were not caused by claws, tools, or weather. They resembled impressions left by something soft, yet strong, something that gripped rather than tore. The forensic specialist who examined them stepped back slowly, claiming the pattern did not resemble any animal she had studied. She refused to speculate further, her voice growing tight as she asked to move on. Witness statements collected from residents offered little clarity, but deepened the confusion. Several people living near the woods reported hearing screams on the night the group vanished, brief, sharp, and quickly smothered by the surrounding trees. One resident claimed she heard whispers afterward, drifting from branch to branch, repeating sounds that mimicked human voices without forming actual words. Another resident reported seeing a dim light weaving between the trunks, pale and cold, moving in strange linear paths that made no sense in natural terrain. The investigators dismissed some of these testimonies as panic-driven or unreliable, but the sheer number of similar descriptions unsettled them. Too many voices repeated the same details: the unnatural quiet, the dragging sound, the clicking. The feeling that the woods themselves shifted underfoot in the center of the search area. Investigators found the most troubling evidence. Scattered across a patch of soft earth were several personal items belonging to the missing groupophone with a cracked screen, a torn piece of fabric, a flashlight with bent casing. The placement of these objects raised questions no one wanted to voice. They were arranged too neatly, spaced out evenly, as if placed with intention, not dropped in panic or struggle. The phone still held a short video clip, although most of it was corrupted. Only 3 seconds remained visible, a shaky flashlight beam sweeping across darkness before landing, briefly on a shape tall enough to blot out the light. The frame froze instantly afterward, filled with a blur of motion that looked like a long limb or branch bending toward the camera. Experts examined the footage and concluded it had not been digitally altered, but none of them could agree on what the shape represented. Some insisted it was a tree distorted by motion. Others said the angle did not match any tree they had seen. A few refused to comment altogether. Psychologists consulted by the investigation reviewed the testimonies and environmental details, suggesting that the woods could induce panic or hallucinations under certain conditions. They spoke of sensory deprivation, fear response, and the mind's ability to create patterns when overwhelmed. But these explanations fell apart when they reviewed the physical evidence: the symmetrical depressions, the unnatural soil patterns, the vertical markings on the trees. These were not hallucinations. These were tangible. Analysts brought thermal scanners to track heat signatures, but every scan returned the same eerie result. The woods were cold in irregular patches, colder than they should be, with no identifiable heat sources anywhere within the boundary. It was as if the forest had pockets of dead air, spots that absorbed warmth rather than held it. The lead investigator, a man who prided himself on rationality, stood at the center of the woods during the final day of the search. He listened, truly listened, to the oppressive stillness around him. That was when he noticed it: the faint tremor beneath the ground, subtle but rhythmic, almost like breathing. He turned to his team, ready to call out, but the tremor stopped instantly, as if the forest recognized his awareness and withdrew. The woods did not want to be understood. They wanted to watch, to wait, to study those who stepped inside. By the time the official report was written, nearly every detail that mattered was softened, diluted, or omitted. The public summary stated only that the group had disappeared under unknown circumstances. But every investigator who walked those woods carried a different truth in their chest of truth they could not articulate without questioning their own stability. Something had moved through the trees with purpose. Something had marked the ground with intelligence. Something had noticed the trespassers long before they realized they were not alone. And whatever it was, it did not leave tracks because it did not need to walk the way living things walked. It moved differently. It learned differently. And it chose when to be seen. Asterisk, in the days that followed the failed search, the town did not simply grieve. It shifted, as though the disappearance carved an invisible fault line beneath daily life, causing everything familiar to tilt just slightly out of place. Families who once lived comfortably near the woods now shut their curtains long before sunset, unable to bear the sight of the dark tree line looming in the distance. At night, the smallest sound, a rattling window pane, a distant owl, the soft groan of settling wood triggered a tension that crept up their spines and settled behind their ribs. The families of the missing group endured something far heavier. Sleep did not bring rest. It brought flashes of imagined shapes moving just beyond the fence, whispers that might have been wind or memory, and the constant crushing fear that something in the woods still held their loved ones in some unknown form. Their homes grew quieter. Conversations shortened. Meals went unfinished. The presence of the empty chairs at their tables became unbearable. The parents who waited for their children to return walked through their homes with a kind of hollow caution, as if afraid of disturbing whatever fragile balance kept their grief from dissolving into madness. They replayed memories with painful clarity, lingering on last conversations, last smiles, last reassurances, wondering if they could have stopped everything by insisting more strongly that the woods were not a place meant for human steps after dark. Neighbors brought casseroles and condolences. But even the comforting rituals of the community felt strained. People spoke softly, their eyes drifting toward the ground, as if avoiding the possibility that something watched them through the windows. When the topic of the woods arose, voices tightened. No one dared to openly repeat the strangest details of the investigation, the symmetrical impressions in the soil. The tree markings, the corrupted video yet, those details sat heavily in every room, pressing between people like an uninvited presence. It became difficult to look one another in the eye, because doing so meant acknowledging the same fear every resident carried. The woods had not simply taken the trespassers, it had studied them, responded to them, and remembered them. Children, who once rode their bicycles along the gravel road, now refused to step outside alone. Some began waking from nightmares they could not describe, trembling and sweating as they told their parents about tall shadows bending between trees, whispers that called their names from the darkness, or the sense of something crawling beneath the floorboards. The adults told them it was stress, imagination, grief. But deep down, every parent felt the same creeping dread that the woods had begun to seep into the collective mind of the town, leaving a residue of fear that no explanation could wash away. The school counselor noted a rise in anxiety, sleeplessness, and strange drawings among the students. Many of the drawings showed the same tall figure standing behind the crooked fence, its limbs too long, its head slightly tilted as if listening. The pattern unsettled her enough that she brought the sketches to the principal, who dismissed them as coincidence. But she kept the drawings anyway, tucking them into a folder she could not bring herself to throw away. The emotional deterioration extended beyond families and children. Even seasoned investigators began to struggle in ways they never disclosed publicly. Some reported hearing faint tapping when they tried to sleep, a rhythmic sound that reminded them too sharply of the patterns recorded in the woods. Others felt the sensation of being watched whenever they passed a window or entered a dark room. A few admitted privately that they avoided mirrors at night, afraid they might see something standing behind them. These unspoken fears became part of their daily routines. They walked faster when nearing wooded areas. They double-checked locks, closed blinds, and left lights on throughout the night. One investigator resigned abruptly, citing personal reasons. But those closest to him knew the truth. He had begun waking each night at the same time, convinced he heard breathing beneath his bedroom floor. Nothing was ever found, but the fear remained. Even the land reacted in subtle ways. Animals avoided the perimeter of the woods entirely. Dogs that once wandered freely now barked fiercely at the tree line. Their hackles raised, their teeth bared at something their owners could not see. Night birds that used to perch near the fence stopped coming altogether. The forest itself appeared darker, heavier, as if the disappearance had shifted something beneath the soil, awakening a quiet hunger that had always lived there. This growing sense of dread settled over the town like a shroud. People moved through their routines carefully, carrying an unspoken understanding that something in the woods had become aware of them, not as a place, but as a presence observing their fear with unsettling patience. The most profound emotional damage came from the lingering possibility that the missing group was not simply gone, but still somewhere in those woods, unseen, unheard, or changed in ways no one dared imagine. The uncertainty gnawed at everyone, creating a restless ache that settled into their bones. They felt the woods watching them. They felt the woods remembering them. And worst of all, they felt the woods waiting, as if it understood that fear itself was a form of nourishment. And the town had become a banquet of trembling hearts and sleepless minds. By the end of the second week, it became clear that the emotional wound carved by the disappearance would not heal quickly. It would remain open, deep, pulsing, because the fear was not rooted in losing the trespassers, but in knowing that whatever lived in the woods did not act randomly. It chose, it observed, and it did not stop with those who entered. It lingered for those who stayed behind. Asterisk, as the shock of the disappearance settled into the bones of the town. Investigators, experts, and desperate family members began gathering theories with the same urgency as people collecting loose pages from a burning book. Everyone wanted meaning. Everyone wanted answers. Yet the more they searched, the more the woods seemed to twist every explanation into something darker. Official investigators returned repeatedly with specialized equipment. Hoping science would reveal what fear attempted to distort, they brought heat scanners, ground penetration devices, and sound tracking instruments, but none behaved as expected once inside the boundary. Heat signatures flickered and vanished in patterns too erratic to belong to wildlife. Ground scanners detected movement beneath the soil, yet the readings showed pathways that curved with unnatural fluidity, as if something traveled beneath the roots with intelligent purpose. Sound monitors captured faint frequencies, not quite mechanical, not quite organic, but steady and rhythmic, like a low hum resonating through wood and earth. Some technicians insisted the frequencies resembled Morse code, but no pattern matched anything known. Others claimed the sounds were identical to breathing, long and slow, as though the forest itself had lungs. These findings were quietly removed from official reports. Not out of deceit, but out of fear that acknowledging them would open a door no one was prepared to face. Several investigators began developing theories rooted in geography and biology. They argued that the land beneath the woods was unstable, shaped by underground rivers or shifting plates, creating vibrations and temperature pockets that confused sensors and disoriented people. Yet this theory failed when a geologist reviewed soil samples and admitted there was no water flow beneath the area, no plate fractures, and no known natural structures capable of producing the patterns recorded. A biologist suggested that a rare species of animal might inhabit the forest, one capable of burrowing silently or camouflaging itself against trees. But when pressed on the size and behavior required to explain the circular depressions, the dragging sounds, and the perfect vertical markings on tree bark, the biologist quietly retracted the theory. No animal native to the region and no known animal at all matched the evidence. The explanations grounded in nature dissolved one by one, leaving an unsettling void where reason should have stood. Local residents, haunted by the strange history of the woods, offered their own theories, heavy with folklore but sharpened by fear. Some spoke of an old story passed down quietly through generations, one that described the woods as a place where the land listened. According to these whispered tales, something ancient had taken root beneath the soil, something that responded to human presence not with aggression, but with a cold, watchful intelligence. Elders recalled hearing about people who entered the woods decades ago and returned changed, refusing to speak of what they saw, staring into corners of rooms as though expecting branches to reach in. They spoke of nights when the forest glowed faintly from within, as if lit by a pale fire beneath the ground. These stories had always been dismissed as exaggerations, but after the disappearance they resurfaced with new weight. The townspeople did not offer these theories proudly. They offered them reluctantly. With the tone of people who wished deeply that their own words were untrue, a separate theory emerged among a small group of independent researchers who reviewed the corrupted video and the soil patterns. They suggested the woods might be responding to frequencies created by human technology. They believed the group's flashlights, phones, or even their footsteps had triggered something dormant. They speculated about unusual magnetic fields, resonant frequencies, or environmental anomalies capable of altering perception and disabling electronics. Yet the theory failed when they realized these conditions would also need to create physical depressions, symmetrical patterns, and tall shadows moving between trees. The more they analyzed, the more their confidence frayed, until one researcher quietly stated that the data behaved as if something was mimicking natural interference intentionally. That idea fractured the entire discussion. The most unsettling theory came from an investigator who spent more hours inside the woods than anyone else. he did not publish it. He did not share it in group meetings. He mentioned it only once, in a quiet conversation with a colleague whose hands shook after reviewing the corrupted video. He said the woods behaved like a predator. Not an animal, but something that studied, tracked, and learned. Something that created silence on purpose. Something that led the group deeper by bending paths and shifting shadows. Something that understood fear enough to use it as a tool. He argued the woods did not simply contain a presence. The woods were the presence or a shell for it. He pointed out that no animals lived within it, no insects hummed beneath it, and no birds perched on its branches. Life did not avoid the woods out of chance. Life avoided the woods because something else occupied that space. When he finished speaking, the colleague refused to continue the conversation. The investigator left the case soon after, unable to sleep without hearing faint tapping against his window, a sound that disappeared each time he turned on the light. By the end of the investigation, dozens of theories existed, yet none answered the question the town feared most. If something in the woods had noticed the trespassers the moment they crossed the fence, then what exactly had noticed them, and how long had it been waiting for someone to do so again? Asterisk, when the official investigation finally withdrew, leaving behind white markers, disturbed soil, and a forest that seemed to stare back at those who dared approach it, the town did not return to normal. Normality required certainty, and nothing about the disappearance or the woods offered even a fragment of it. Instead, life settled into an uneasy rhythm, one shaped by avoidance, fear, and the quiet knowledge that something in the trees had not merely taken the trespassers, had acknowledged them. As days faded into weeks, the woods appeared unchanged to the eye, yet everyone who walked near the fence line felt an invisible shift in the air, as if the forest had grown aware of its own scrutiny. A heavy stillness clung to the perimeter each evening, thick enough to make breathing feel like an intrusion. The families of the missing had not found closure. They lived suspended between grief and a deeper, stranger arcane ache, formed by the unbearable thought that their loved ones might still exist somewhere within that darkness. Altered or imprisoned or simply unseen, they could not look toward the woods without imagining faces hidden between trunks. Mouths open, as if trying to form words they could no longer remember how to speak. Their grief became a shape, a presence that drifted through their homes at night. Pressing on their chests like the weight of soil, they left porch lights on even at dawn. They avoided mirrors after sunset. They listened through walls for sounds they hoped never to hear. The larger town bore its own scars. People walked faster on the streets closest to the woods. Businesses near the edge reported strange disturbances, flickering lights, trembling shelves, the sensation of footsteps pacing behind walls where there were none. The woods became a quiet boundary of fear, looming not as a landscape but as a presence waiting in plain sight. Those who worked early morning shifts often claimed they saw dim glows between the trees before sunrise, pale flickers that moved with unsettling purpose. Others swore they heard faint tapping against their back doors long after midnight, though no footprints ever appeared in the soil. A few residents admitted privately that they sometimes dreamt of walking through the woods, not as themselves, but as something taller, slower, something that moved without sound and watched without blinking. They woke, shaken and silent, unable to voice the dread that followed them into daylight. Even those who scoffed at superstition found themselves unable to deny that the woods seemed to lean closer to town each night, as if listening, learning, and waiting. And then there were the new warnings, unspoken, unposted but shared in tense glances and lowered voices. People avoided discussing the woods around children, as if fear itself were contagious. Some claimed the keep-out signs appeared more bent each week. The weather alone could not explain the deep indentations across the metal. Others noticed fresh impressions in the soil near the fence, perfect circles as smooth as those found during the investigation. The ground still trembled on certain nights, faintly enough that anyone inside town might dismiss it as imagination, but unmistakable to those living closest to the tree line. The animals continued to avoid the area entirely. Birds veered sharply away. Coyotes circled wider paths. Even insects behaved strangely, no buzzing near the bark, no nests in the low branches. as if life itself refused to cross a line that humans had ignored. There was one moment that deepened the fear into something permanent. Late one night, weeks after the investigators left, a couple driving along the rural stretch near the woods saw something tall standing between the trees. The figure did not move when the headlights hit it, but its posture bent slightly, as if observing them with slow curiosity. The couple froze, unable to command their breath or their thoughts. The figure elongated in the shadows, stretching with a fluidity that did not match bone or muscle, before sinking behind the nearest tree without bending a single branch. The couple drove away trembling, unable to convince themselves that fear had distorted their senses. They told no one for days. When they finally spoke, their voices shook with a clarity that suggested they wished deeply to be wrong. But the details aligned too closely with the video clip, the eyewitness testimonies, the impressions in the soil. Something in the woods was tall. Something moved with understanding. Something did not fear light. The most haunting change, however, came not from sightings or sounds, but from a shared feeling that settled over the town like a second atmosphere. People sensed they were no longer observing the woods. The woods were observing them. Windows facing the tree line felt colder. Doors seemed to creak more often. The night air carried an almost electrical hum near the fence, vibrating faintly through the bones of anyone who lingered too long. The forest did not need to move to send a message. It simply existed with a growing presence, as though waiting for another group to step across the threshold, guarded so patiently. And so the town lived with a question that grew heavier as the seasons shifted. A question that pressed itself into every quiet moment. If the woods noticed the trespassers the moment they ignored the warnings, then who or what waits now, listening for the next person bold enough to do the same?